Committee will come to order. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's subcommittee hearing. I first want to apologize a bit for the late start, but we had a series of votes, so we were called to the floor to vote, and so I hope you'll take that into consideration, but hopefully we won't have any other interruptions. And I want to thank Ms. Gabbard, Tulsi Gabbard from the great state of Hawaii for being the ranking member here today. Annie Felium-Vega from American Samoa is unable to make it, and we know that she'll do an excellent job for the other side, so thank you very much. The United States' presence in the Asia-Pacific is built on promoting regional stability, fostering respect for international law, advancing respect for human rights, and maintaining freedom of navigation and unhindered lawful commerce in the maritime regions. These objectives are fundamentally hinged on the United States' alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, and the Philippines, and our resilient relationships with Taiwan and Singapore, and our evolving relationships with Vietnam and Indonesia. As the title of today's hearing implies, what is America's future in Asia? One thing is certain: the United States will never leave Asia, because as a Pacific nation, we recognize that the nexus of global commerce and strategy has transitioned to the Western Pacific, and the strong bonds formed with our friends and allies cannot be broken. However, America's presence in the region is being challenged. The recent flare-up of confrontations between China and its neighbors over sovereignty claims in the East and South China Seas is the latest example of how decades-old conflicts could easily pivot from fishermen skirmishes into all-out military battles. China is attempting to seize its primacy over the Asia-Pacific region at the expense of its neighbors. These moves may well be aimed at undermining the interests of the U.S. and its allies, challenging the administration's strategic rebalance efforts, and altering the myth that China seeks a peaceful rise. Take, for example, the increasing frequency of clashes between Chinese maritime law enforcement authorities and Vietnamese, Philippine, and Japanese fishing vessels, or the confrontations between the U.S. Navy and Chinese naval vessels, including the time the USNS Impeccable was harassed by Chinese vessels in 2009, and the recent USS Cowpens incident. Let us also not forget the 2001 Hainan Island incident when a U.S. EP-3 electronic surveillance aircraft and a People's Liberation Army Navy fighter jet collided midair. Any misstep in these situations, an overzealous pilot or fisherman, could have unnecessarily escalated tensions to the breaking point. From my perspective, the administration appears to be struggling to find a way to better direct America's resources toward the Asia-Pacific and find a way to manage the growth of maritime territorial disputes, surely the greatest threat at this point to the strategic rebalance policy. Without a coherent and cohesive direction, these disputes could significantly impact America's ability to promote regional peace and stability, enhance economic prosperity, and preserve U.S. interests. Finding a way to mitigate these growing tensions and decrease the chances of miscalculation will not be easy. I think Japan's decision to create a National Security Council is a significant positive step, because not only will it more efficiently direct Japanese foreign and defense policies regarding national security, but it will also allow for stronger collaboration with the United States, something that is critically needed. I support efforts to revise the U.S.-Japan bilateral defense guidelines, as well as the consideration to locate rotational U.S. troops in the Philippines, as we've done in Australia. At the same time, I urge our regional allies to be measured in their actions and rhetoric, because even a slightly provocative remark could further and unnecessarily inflame tensions. I also believe the administration needs to do a better job at clearly conveying U.S. commitment to working with and supporting our regional allies. China's unilateral action to impose an air defense identification zone over the East China Sea presented the administration with an opportunity to do this, but instead of rising to the occasion, it sent mixed signals of its willingness to stand up to China's acts of provocation. While I do not believe it is in the United States' best interest to contain China, I do think balancing its rise by maintaining a strong regional presence that is focused, engaged, and forceful is imperative. Unfortunately, that is not where we are today. And since the hearing this subcommittee held a year ago with then Assistant Secretary Robert Blake and Acting Assistant Secretary Joseph Yun, efforts to strategically rebalance the U.S. toward Asia still lack a long-term sustainable focus. They are still hinged on ambitious rhetoric that have not reassured our allies or partners in the region, or anyone else for that matter. As a result, China sees the Obama administration as weak and indecisive and will continue its attempts to fill a perceived power vacuum in the region unless we find a way to enhance our presence across the board. In the meantime, as China continues to flex its muscles, countries around the region are recalculating and hedging on whether they can count on the U.S. Consequently, I think it is in the interest of this country and the interest of our regional allies, notably Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, for the U.S. to once and for all articulate a coherent strategy that is fundamentally built on actions. It's time for the administration to move beyond speeches and find a way to reassure the region that the United States is there to stay and that America's future in Asia is strong, committed, and absolute. And I'd now like to yield to the gentlelady from Hawaii for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your bringing attention to this critical issue for us to discuss and have this necessary conversation that answers the question of what is the United States' role in the Asia-Pacific region, and being able to bring about a better understanding of the current situation so that we can best address what that role should be, both with the challenges that we're presented with today, but also so that we can project long-term into the future. As was previously mentioned, China's expansion in the East China Sea and its claim over the Senkaku Islands is something that has escalated tensions with both Japan and South Korea. Last month, China expanding its maritime law enforcement presence, enforcing its fisheries law in South China Sea's contested waters, has done the same. We need to seek cooperation in order to achieve the maritime and air safety within the region that I think is a common objective for all interested parties, and continue to be proactive in the Asia-Pacific region to mitigate as much as possible the risk of an accidental military clash. I think the United States needs to remain engaged with China in a proactive, sustained, and strategic manner, using diplomatic, peaceful means to try to address these disputes. Abiding by international airspace and maritime rules will decrease the threat to peace and stability in the region. Obviously, there are several sensitivities that the United States will need to navigate through and balance in order to have an effective strategy in strengthening relations both with China as well as our allies, longtime allies within the region. As I mentioned, it's in the best interest of all parties to maintain freedom of navigation both in international waters and international airspace. It's time to be proactive now before we end up in a situation where there is a trigger, there is an escalation, and we're dealing with a crisis that is highly elevated and one that will involve many of the countries in the region. Given the increase in trade among nations on the Pacific Rim, the urgency of setting clear norms, of having a deeper understanding and acceptable territorial borders is paramount. I look forward to reviewing our positions and policies in the Asia-Pacific region as we assess our future role in the region, as we also address the immediate air and maritime safety concerns. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for bringing us together to really look at this important issue, and look forward to hearing from our witness today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Salmon, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Chairman, Steve Shabbat, for holding this important hearing. Secretary Russell, thank you for coming to testify before this subcommittee. Since the administration announced their pivot toward the Asia-Pacific region in 2011, we've seen the tensions in the region escalate. They've risen. The hope was that there was U.S. influence in the region. A significant influence would help balance China's growing aggressiveness with their neighbors. Unfortunately, I fear the pivot has been in name only, and the administration's strategy in Asia remains overpowered by other regions around the globe. Over the last several years, we've seen increased aggressions in the disputed waters of the South China Sea and more recently in the East China Sea. As China sought to expand their control in the region, Our allies are struggling to ensure their sovereignty is maintained and navigational rights to the South and East China Seas protected. Military and commercial access to the navigable waters of the South and East China Seas are critical to the security and economic viability of every country in the region. Strong U.S. allies, including Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Vietnam, and South Korea, have come under increasing pressure from China to cede or temper these inalienable sovereign rights to Chinese will. There must be a peaceful path forward that protects U.S. regional allies, ensures U.S. national security interests, and avoids unnecessary conflict and aggressions. One of my heroes of the region, President Ma of Taiwan, has proposed the East China Sea Peace Initiative as a means to resolving disputes peacefully by exercising restraint, refraining from taking antagonistic actions, and following international law and continuing the dialogue. I hope the Chinese and other regional powers will embrace this as a solution going forward. It's the most proactive, positive solution I think that's on the table yet. China have indicated that they have a desire to settle disputes peacefully, but they've been unwilling to open dialogue and negotiations in a multilateral way, and this is extremely disappointing. And I would hope that as we go forward, we will all come to some recommendations or conclusions that will help strengthen our allies in the region. And like you, Mr. Chairman, I don't believe any of us want to do anything to contain China. I've been one of the most vigorous proponents of free trade with China. I believe in this entire body, but we cannot neglect our allies in the region, and there has to be a constructive dialogue. President Ma has put a reasonable proposal on the table. I'd like to see us run with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for making an opening statement.
We all agree we should be engaged in the region. We ought to provide diplomatic support for our allies. But I fear that we've already begun to go overboard. Within the thing called the Pentagon budget, well over $600 billion, there are shifts, and we could say that we are now spending tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars a year allocable to this effort to fight over a few islands, most of which are so tiny that no one in history has ever chosen to live there. Already I see us shifting our research, our training, our force configuration to facing down China in the South China Sea. Compare that to Japan, which consistently spends only 1% of its GDP on its military and is ready to see us allocate tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to fighting for a few islands that they will wish to exploit for economic purposes. Keep in mind that neither Vietnam nor Japan sent any forces to fight in the UN action in Afghanistan, the place from which America was attacked for the first time in the lifetime of, I think, just about everybody on this panel. So likewise, these islands do sit astride trade routes, but for the most part, they sit astride this trade route between the United States and China. And you can say, well, hundreds of billions of dollars of trade goes through that area. Yes, trade between the United States and China, trade between China and other nations. It meets the institutional needs of the Pentagon for us to begin a new Cold War with China. It gives them the kind of adversary that we have prevailed upon in glorious actions, uniformed, technological. The great victories of our military were in World War II and the Cold War. And it is understandable that we will be told by the Pentagon that we now have another great opportunity to confront a large, militarily sophisticated, uniformed, and conventional foe. But keep in mind, we're talking about islands no one's chosen to live on. We're talking about countries that have always supported us or often supported us diplomatically, but not militarily. And that they themselves, especially in the case of Japan, limit their own military commitment while asking us for a much more open-ended commitment. These are uninhabited islands. Let's stay calm. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I'll submit a statement for the record.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Scott, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'll also submit a statement.
Okay. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Messer, is recognized.
Let me hit my button. I guess I'm a rookie. There you go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very much appreciate the opportunity to be here at this hearing. Looking forward to the opportunity to travel to the region with many of you just in the coming couple of weeks. Would just sort of hope for Mr. Russell and emphasize the importance of talking today about the President Mao's from Taiwan's East China Sea Peace Initiative, and the importance of, as we work through the challenges in that region, that we apply common sense and listen to our allies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and introduce our distinguished panelists here this afternoon. Mr. Daniel Russell is the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. Prior to his appointment as Assistant Secretary, Mr. Russell served as the White House as Special Assistant to the President and National Security Staff. During his tenure there, he helped formulate President Obama's strategic rebalance to Asia. Before joining the National Security Staff, he served as Director of the Office of Japanese Affairs and had other various assignments in Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, and Cyprus. He's also served as Chief of Staff to Ambassador Thomas R. Pickering and Assistant to the Ambassador to Japan, former Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. Mr. Russell was awarded the State Department's Una Chapman Cox Fellowship Sabbatical and authored the book America's Places in the World. Before joining the Foreign Service, he was manager for an international firm in New York City. Mr. Russell was educated at Sarah Lawrence College and University College, University of London, UK. And we welcome you here this afternoon, Mr. Russell. And since we have only one panelist, we'll be extending your time for a statement from 5 minutes to 7 minutes before we'll ask questions. So you're recognized for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're very kind, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to Ms. Gabbard and the other members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today on these important issues. Before I begin, I'd respectfully request that you accept my written testimony for the record. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Chairman for his leadership on the issue and his work to enhance our engagement with the Asia-Pacific region. The members of this subcommittee know full well the importance of our interests in the Asia-Pacific region. As Secretary Kerry has made very, very clear, at the core of our strategic rebalancing is a determination to ensure that the Asia-Pacific region remains open, inclusive, and prosperous, and that it's guided by accepted rules and standards and respect for international law. Through our alliances, through our partnerships, the U.S. has been instrumental in sustaining a maritime regime based on international law that has allowed the countries in the region to prosper. And as a maritime nation with global trading networks, the U.S. has a national interest in the maintenance of peace and stability, respect for international law, unimpeded lawful commerce, and freedom of navigation and overflight, including and especially in the East China Sea and the South China Sea areas. For these reasons, the behavior and the tensions between the claimants are of deep concern to us and to our allies. An incident in these waters could touch off an escalatory cycle which would have very serious adverse effects on our economic and our security interests. That's why the Obama administration has consistently emphasized the importance of exercising restraint, of maintaining open channels of dialogue, of lowering rhetoric, of behaving safely and responsibly both in the sky and the sea, and peacefully resolving territorial and maritime disputes in keeping with international law. We oppose and we have sought to prevent unilateral actions that disrupt the status quo or jeopardize that peace and security. In the South China Sea, we have supported efforts by ASEAN and China to reach agreement on an effective code of conduct, which is long overdue, in order to promote a rules-based framework for managing and regulating the behavior of the countries. And in the East China Sea, we remain concerned about the serious downturn in Sino-Japanese relations. It is important to lower tensions, to turn down the rhetoric, and to exercise caution and restraint in this sensitive area. However, China's announcement of an air defense identification zone, an ADIZ, in the East China Sea in late November was a step in the wrong direction. We neither recognize nor accept China's declared ADIZ. The United States has no intention of changing how we conduct our operations in the region. And we've made clear to China that it shouldn't attempt to implement that ADIZ and should refrain from taking similar actions elsewhere in the region. Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned at the outset, the U.S. has a deep and long-standing stake in the maintenance of prosperity and stability in the Asia-Pacific, and an equally deep and abiding long-term interest in the continued freedom of the seas based on the rule of law, rule that guarantees, among other things, freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, and the other internationally lawful uses of the sea. International law also makes clear the legal basis on which states can legitimately assert their rights in the maritime domain or can exploit maritime resources. So the United States takes the strong position that maritime claims must accord with customary international law. Even though the United States isn't a claimant, and even though the United States takes no position on the competing claims to sovereignty over disputed land features in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, we believe strongly, as I said, that the claims must accord with international law. We also care deeply that all countries deal with the territorial and their maritime disputes peacefully, diplomatically, and in accordance with international law. This means ensuring that claimants manage their differences without intimidation, coercion, or the use of force. We are candid with claimants, all the claimants, when we have concerns regarding their claims or the behavior in the way that they pursue them. Deputy Secretary Bill Burns and I were in Beijing last month and held extensive discussions with Chinese officials, for example. In these discussions, we directly raised our concerns about what we see as a growing incremental pattern of efforts by China to assert control over the area contained in the so-called 9-dash line in the South China Sea. Among other steps, this includes continued restrictions on access to the Scarborough Reef, pressure on the long-standing Philippine presence at the Second Thomas Shoal, and the recent updating of fishing regulations covering disputed areas in the South China Sea. Our view is that these actions have raised tensions in the region and have exacerbated concerns about China's long-term strategic objectives. China's lack of clarity with regard to its South China Sea claims have created uncertainty in the region and limit the prospect for achieving mutually agreeable resolution or equitable joint development arrangements. At the risk of repeating myself, I want to reinforce the point, Mr. Chairman, that under international law, maritime claims in the South China Sea must be derived from land features, and any Chinese claim to maritime rights not based on claimed land features would be inconsistent with international law. China could highlight its respect for international law by clarifying or adjusting its claim to bring it into accordance with international law of the sea. Along with that, we strongly support serious and sustained bilateral as well as multilateral dialogue among claimants to address and manage overlapping claims in a peaceful and non-coercive way. We support the rights of the claimants themselves to avail themselves of peaceful dispute mechanisms. The Philippines itself chose to exercise such a right last year with the filing of an arbitration case under the law of the sea. Now, these legal and diplomatic processes will take time, but the relevant parties in the near term can take steps to lower tension and avoid escalation. That includes practical mechanisms to prevent incidents or manage them when they occur. Another would be for the claimants to agree not to undertake new unilateral steps to change the status quo. In the meantime, the U.S. is committed to promoting regional stability through continued strong diplomatic and military presence. This includes our efforts to promote best practices and good cooperation on all aspects of maritime security and to bolster maritime domain awareness, including through our capacity building programs throughout Southeast Asia. It includes strengthening institutions like ASEAN and the East Asia Summit as regional venues where countries can engage in dialogue with all involved, both about the principles but also about practical measures to avoid conflict. This is an issue of immense importance to the United States, to the Asia Pacific, and to the world, and I want to reaffirm here today that the United States will continue to play the central role in underwriting security and stability in the Asia Pacific that has guaranteed peace and facilitated prosperity for the last 6+ decades. Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for the opportunity to appear here today, and I look forward to hearing further views from the members of the committee and to answering any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And before I begin the questioning here, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize an old hand here, somebody that served our institution for probably 20 years or so, who was chairman of the Intelligence Committee and served his district in Michigan very well, and that's Congressman Pete Hoekstra. Pete, why don't you stand up there? You deserve to be recognized. So, thank you for your service. And I'll begin with myself. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Russell, since the administration announced its policy to strategically rebalance toward the Asia Pacific back in 2011, many said this strategic pivot was implemented as a way to contain China's rise. China surely believes this to be the case, and some believe this policy is the root cause of China's sense of paranoia, which instigated the intensification of its provocative and aggressive actions in the maritime regions in that part of the world. At the end of the day, do you think the United States' forward presence in the region is more escalatory than not? Have our efforts to increase our presence correlated with the increase in regional tensions? If not, then what other explanations do you give for the rise in tensions over the last few years? And I think, as Congressman Salmon and I, both indicated in our opening statements, we're not interested in containing China. We do think that they need to act as a civilized nation, as a leader, if they want to be treated as one, and unfortunately their actions have been quite provocative. But what do you say about the rebalance or the pivot, whatever terminology one prefers?
Well, thank you very much for the thoughtful question, Mr. Chairman. I'd begin, if I may, by saying that when I was first seconded to the White House, to the National Security Council, in January of 2009, I heard and saw from the President and from the senior administration officials a commitment to strategic rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region based on U.S. interests. So the rebalance certainly dates back to 2009, to the very beginning of the administration, and has, I would say, and has always had 6 basic lines of effort. First, to strengthen our alliances. Second, to participate and to build up regional institutions. Thirdly, to engage emerging powers, including and especially China. Fourth, to promote economic development that benefits the U.S. and the countries in the region. Fifth, to champion the values that America cherishes, values of democracy, and to strengthen civil society in the region. And sixth, to diversify our engagement. In other words, use our soft power in addition to our strong military alliances and presences. That having been said, I'm convinced that a diminution or a withdrawal of U.S. Engagement and presence, to answer your question in the inverse, would be a major destabilizing factor in the region.
Well, not to cut you off there, but and I agree with you that it would be, and we shouldn't do that. But my question is the way China interprets this, and it seems that they interpret it very differently than we intended it, and that's really what I'm getting at. Do you think their actions in any way are a reflection of what we're doing here, rebalancing allegedly from the Middle East to Southeast Asia?
I do not, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
I recognize that there are many in China who either believe or find it convenient to argue that the U.S. strategy of engagement in the Asia-Pacific region is in some fashion at odds with China's own interests or arguably part of a containment strategy. It is not.
Okay. Let me stop you there if I can, because I've only got 2 minutes, and I want to get one more question at least. The budget for the East Asia and Pacific Bureau is the second smallest of the bureaus at the State Department. Vying for funds with the Middle East is surely no easy task, because despite troop withdrawals across that region, much of the administration's focus is centered on crises occurring in the Middle East, that part of the world. That being said, the Asia-Pacific region is the future. It's the driver of the global economy and will make or break our geopolitical role in the world, I believe. Balancing the need to increase our level of engagement in the Asia-Pacific with the budget constraints here in Washington, how do you propose that we best increase our presence while restraining the cost of that engagement?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Needless to say, you're preaching to the choir. Secretary Kerry and, of course, I and my colleagues have been vigorous advocates for not only the State Department budget, but for fully resourcing the strategic rebalance in the Asia-Pacific region. And against the backdrop of fiscal constraint, as you alluded to, we have seen important increases and other areas where our budget have been protected, certainly relative to that of other agencies. The lines of effort that we're pursuing in the State Department and as a government include activist diplomacy, include the clear and outspoken statements, public assertion of our policy, which has an important effect and is influential in providing confidence to our partners and allies in the region. A robust military presence, which must continue and that is enhanced greatly by our unique system of alliances and security partnerships. An aggressive effort to develop partner capacity, including by strengthening maritime domain awareness and other forms that allow our partners to act and to operate. And importantly, Mr. Chairman, our active engagement in the multilateral institutions that serve to help rule setting. These are projects that our men and women in our embassies and in our militaries are actively engaged in every day.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. The ranking member, gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Gabbard, is recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chabot. I'm going to pick up where he just left off. You know, obviously come from a state, Hawaii, that someone just told me this morning, I thought it was a great terminology, where we are the strategic point of the spear for our country's focus on the Asia-Pacific region geographically. So keep a very close eye and are very keenly aware of things that are happening on an ongoing basis, but also aware of the opportunity that exists within the region. And it is a question that often arises both here at home, but also from some of our allies in the region, is are we really serious about this focus on the Asia-Pacific? When numbers come out as they are, the chairman pointed out your department's budget being the second smallest in Department of State. In Hawaii, we have the East-West Center, which I think you're keenly aware of. also has seen a reduction in funding this year. When is this priority going to start taking place or showing through in very real and practical ways?
Well, thank you for that question, Ms. Gabbard. We are committed, and Secretary Kerry is committed, not only to the Asia-Pacific region, but to an active and effective presence, active and effective forms of engagement throughout the Asia-Pacific region. The East-West Center is an extremely important venue for us. President Obama, of course, has a personal connection there. I know the head of the East-West Center is in Washington, and I'm scheduled to meet with him soon. The programs that we engage in, not only in Hawaii, but in the region, are aimed at reaching out to governments, to civil society, and to ensure that our connections with the countries in the region are more than simply professions of bilateral ties, that these are grassroots and people-to-people connections. So what Secretary Kerry, in terms of resource and in terms of direction, has focused on includes economic engagement, educational exchange, cooperative programs that pertain to energy, climate, and other transnational issues and threats of common concern, economic development, everything from the Trans-Pacific Partnership to a range of commercial and other sorts of programs.
No, I appreciate your talking about that, and one of the assets that the East-West Center provides is it is at that grassroots level where you're having that exposure and that engagement with people who go back to their countries, who become leaders within their countries, and takes a very proactive approach. I'd like to talk a little bit about, let's see, I've got a lot of questions here. You talked about the effective code of conduct agreed to by the ASEAN nations and China. Could you just touch quickly on the progress of that and what the guidelines, kind of the framework is for that?
Well, in 2002, ASEAN and China reached agreement on a declaration of conduct that established certain principles and that also committed them to negotiate a code of conduct that would oversee the behavior of the parties in the region. The two elements to a code of conduct which we see great value to are, first, reaching consensus between ASEAN and China about acceptable forms of behavior among claimants and relevant parties in the South China Sea based on the principles of peaceful resolution, respect for international law, no unilateral changes to the status quo, and so on. A second dimension of the code of conduct that we believe can be expedited, should be expedited, is the development of practical mechanisms to prevent incidents that could trigger an escalatory cycle or to manage those incidents should they occur. The United States has abundant experience with procedures to prevent incidents at sea. We have put our experience and our expertise at the disposal of the ASEANs. We're actively engaged in partnerships through a number of the ASEAN-related forum for maritime cooperation and maritime security. We think that there is no reason why a code of conduct can't be negotiated quickly or that practical steps can't be taken in the interim.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Salmon, is recognized, who is also the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I served in Congress back in the 90s, our Secretary of State delineated a policy with China that was very confusing. It was called strategic ambiguity, and it sounds like an oxymoron. I think that since that time, as a country, we've tried desperately to seek strategic clarity in dealing with China, and we've expanded our trade relations with China. We've advocated for permanent normal trade relations. There ascension to the WTO. And we've, I think, acted every bit as a good partner should. But given the fact that in the last couple of years especially, they've increased their antagonistic ways in the South and East China Seas, what more can we do? I mentioned in my opening statement that President Ma of Taiwan has recommended this East China Sea Peace Initiative. Mr. Russell, do you have any thoughts on that as far as, is that something we could pick up and run with? It doesn't call for military action, and it certainly opens the door for meaningful dialogue, but it has to happen with all interested parties. And what role can the United States take in establishing that kind of a peace initiative?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Salmon. In diplomacy, as in other aspects of life, timing is everything. And I think it is unfortunate that President Ma's peace initiative, when it was announced, did not fall on fertile soil or water, so to speak. There are a number of very important elements to that initiative. Others have made proposals, including President Aquino, who similarly proposed a zone of peace and cooperation. When you break apart these initiatives and look at the key elements thereof, you find the principles that are at the heart of the U.S. strategy and the U.S. effort, namely respect for international law and peaceful resolution of disputes. Our activist diplomacy, both bilateral and multilateral, at the presidential level, at the secretary's level, and at my level, is aimed at seeking consensus, not just lip service, but practical operational consensus around these principles, including the principles of respect for international law. All of the claimants need to define their claims clearly in ways that are consistent with international law. This particularly applies to China. The ambiguity of China's claim and the behavior of Chinese assets in asserting these claims is a destabilizing factor. We have made that point directly to the Chinese. I was recently, as I mentioned, in Beijing. This is something that Secretary Kerry has taken up directly, something that we have included in our clear public statements.
You know, I was one of the strongest advocates for passage of permanent normal trade relations because I believe that our further engaging with China in trade and opening up more and more doors for China to do business with the United States was a really, really good thing. And I remember having to speak to a lot of my colleagues who were real reticent about it because of some of the horrendous human rights abuses in China and on and on and on. I mean, several issues, aggression towards Taiwan. And I advocated that passage of the permanent normal trade relations would ultimately lead to better relations in the region and maybe an improvement in human rights. I've been really disappointed. I mean, I've been incredibly disappointed that China hasn't taken the ball and run with it. And it seems to me that they're just playing a game of dare. You know, we're going to see what we can get away with. And if the U.S. has the guts, the cojones, to challenge us. And given the fact that, you know, this pivot that was supposed to happen, but I don't believe it really has happened, has maybe kind of emboldened them. I'd just like to encourage us to maybe practice a little bit of tough love with them and let them know that we're just not going to stand for or tolerate those kind of aggressive actions, because some of those aggressive actions have actually materialized into violence, and that's just not tolerable.
Well, Congressman, let me make absolutely clear that the United States is committed to and is working to achieve a stable, constructive, cooperative relationship with China. The President, the Secretary, the members of the Cabinet have vigorously pursued that effort. But by the same token, we are also committed to a relationship that allows us to speak clearly and candidly, to respond directly on areas of significant difference. We want, and the region needs, a China that embraces the rule of law. We need a China that is a net contributor to the stability and the security of the region. To achieve that, we have a deliberate and, I would say, sophisticated strategy that combines the search for practical cooperation on areas of genuine importance to both of our citizens and to the world. That is everything from climate change to North Korea. But it also enables us to address directly areas of difference, areas of concern, and problem behavior, even when, to the chagrin of the Chinese, that requires us to publicly call them out or impose reputational costs. The key to our China strategy, Congressman, is the strength of our partnerships and our security alliances in the Asia-Pacific. That is the underpinning that has allowed China to prosper, as you alluded to. That is the framework with which we will continue to work constructively with China.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from California, who is also...
The gentleman from Virginia first.
Okay, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank my colleague, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Russell, of course, I'm listening to my colleague, and I certainly can sympathize with what he's saying, but to assert something is not tolerable with respect to Chinese behavior in the South China Sea is fascinating to hear. I'm not quite sure what it translates into in terms of policy. What are we prepared to do to curb Chinese excesses as we perceive them in that region?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I'll tell you a bit about what we are doing as a practical matter to address this. First and foremost, as I said, we are strengthening our alliances and our security posture. We are present and accounted for in our defense capacity in a significant and in a sustained and credible way. Secondly, we are working with a range of partner countries to help build local capacity, to develop their ability to monitor their own airspace, their own territorial waters, and to acquire the wherewithal to defend themselves and their interests in a responsible way. This is something that the United States does bilaterally, but it is something that we do also with our partners and through international fora. Thirdly, we engage with China directly, as well as with the ASEANs and with neighbors, including India, including Australia, in the multilateral fora that we are attempting to strengthen. The regional architecture in the Asia-Pacific region is underdeveloped, and the decision in 2010 by President Obama to sign the treaty with ASEAN and to begin participating on an annual basis, both U.S.-ASEAN leaders meetings and in the East Asia Summit, was a major milestone in terms of commitment to U.S. presence that had a palpable impact on China's calculus and China's behavior.
Thank you. One of the concerns I have in this whole situation, talked about in previous hearing, is the space for miscalculation. One looks at what China is doing, and one is concerned. It looks from a distance like it's picking a fight with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Japan, among others. And one may not intend by declaring, a air defense identification zone, one may not intend to do something overtly provocative, but the result might be just that. And the probability of an accidental military incursion or worse starts to rise, frankly, especially when you pick fights with more actors in the region and encompassing more of the region. What is the United States' position on that? I mean, is that a concern of ours, and have we relayed that concern to the Chinese government? And what's our reading of the Chinese government? Have they thought that through, do you think, in a satisfactory way? I mean, is that of concern to them as well?
Well, thank you, Congressman. We are very mindful of the risk of unintended conflict or of accidents. No analyst that I know or respect believes that China or, frankly, other major players in the Asia-Pacific region have any desire for or intention to engage in conflict deliberately. But as Vice President Biden is fond of saying, there's something worse than an intended conflict, and that's an unintended conflict. To that end, to avoid that, two major lines of effort by the United States include the direct engagement with the Chinese and with the People's Liberation Army in an upgrade of mill-mill relations between the U.S. and China, which has enabled us to improve our ability to communicate. That doesn't obviate occasions in which the U.S. and Chinese assets are at odds, as witnessed the recent case of the USS Cowpens. But it does allow for a level of communication that permits U.S. and Chinese officers to resolve issues peaceably, which was also the case with the Cowpens. The second line of effort is more broadly with our allies and with our partners, whether it's Japan, whether it's the Philippines, or whether it's others. We are actively promoting regional mechanisms to prevent incidents and to manage them when they occur, everything from hotlines to rules of engagement. This is one important reason why the U.S. Strongly supports the call by Japan for better communications and incident avoidance procedures in the East China Sea with China.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my colleague, Mr. Sherman, for his courtesy.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How the United States decides to engage with the maritime conflicts or the air disputes in the East and South China Seas, it not only sends important messages to our allies as to how we take care of them, but it says to other countries around the world that might not necessarily be an ally, but someone that we have a strategic relationship with. And one nation that I know has been paying very, very close attention to how we handle these is India. And, they watch, any engagement we have with China, and they watch it closely. So what would you say, any potential action or inaction in the East and South China Seas that we undertake, what do you think that means for our strategic relationship with India?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. With the caveat that my personal area of responsibility in the State Department does not extend as far as India, I would say that India, including as an active member of the East Asia Summit, India, by virtue of its Look East policy, India as the world's largest democracy, and given its strategic place in the Indo-Pacific geography, has an important role to play, an important contribution to make. We have a consultation with India, which I'm looking forward to undertaking as Assistant Secretary on the Asia-Pacific region, and I have been in touch on the margins of multilateral meetings with my Indian counterparts. Others of our Asian allies, including and especially Japan, have intense consultations as well. The Prime Minister of Japan was recently there. Fundamentally, the rules of the South China Sea and the East China Sea apply in the Indian Ocean and apply globally. The absolute requirement, and a requirement that is incumbent on China to embrace, to respect rules of the road, to accept that international law applies equally to big countries and small, to strong and weak, is a principle, a set of principles that I believe is essential to India. And that the efforts by the United States, including in the multilateral forum, to champion these principles have a significant impact and, I believe, the support of the Indian democracy.
Well, it's hard to see how we can have a pivot to India without a pivot to Asia without really thinking about India. Because India is a country where we have a very special strategic relationship with. We're bound by, as you pointed out, it's the world's largest democracy. We're the world's oldest democracy. And the business relationships that we have between the United States and India are deep and far-reaching. I think that India is a balance to China there. I mean, obviously those two look at each other all the time, and so do you think there are ways where we can better incorporate India into our pivot to Asia and perhaps use it as a foil of China, a balance to China?
Well, thank you, Congressman. Our strategy, as I said earlier, is not to contain China. Our goal is not to disadvantage China's legitimate interests, and our policies are not aimed at any one country, and we don't use our relationships, including our relationship with India, as a lever or a bludgeon against China. However, the issues at stake are global issues. As democracies and as seafaring nations, India and the United States share a common interest in respect for international law, in protection of freedom of navigation and overflight, and in the vigorous defense of unimpeded lawful commerce. India is a neighbor not only to China but also to Burma, Myanmar, and has an important east-west corridor of trade, a corridor that is important to India's economic future because of the huge opportunities for economic growth in that very dynamic region of Southeast Asia. India is dependent on the sea lanes, as is so many of its neighbors, and therefore the safety and the security of the seas, a safety and security that's predicated not on coastal navies, but on the respect for international law.
The gentleman's
Thank you.
time's expired. Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized, who is also the ranking member of the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Thank you. China has land border disputes as well, with India, perhaps Pakistan, Vietnam, perhaps Burma, Russia. Has China ever agreed to or suggested international arbitration or international litigation of any of its land or maritime border disputes?
Well, thank you, Congressman. As you pointed out, China has not only something like 24 neighbors, but something like 24 border disputes. Now, China has at various times made progress in resolving and reconciling some of these disputes.
I know China's engaged in bilateral negotiations. Have they urged or agreed to the submission of any of these disputes to any international panel?
The Chinese position, particularly with regard to its territorial disputes in Southeast Asia and in the East China Sea, insists that the only satisfactory approach is bilateral negotiations.
So
we do not agree. And moreover, in addition to bilateral and multilateral fora, we respect and defend the right of all claimant states to avail themselves of legitimate international legal mechanisms. The case in point is the Philippines.
I understand. Let me go on. The Senkaku Islands, as Japan calls
Yes.
it. They've got a claim, and as I understand it, they've had an air notification system with regard to those islands in place for quite some time. Is that correct?
Correct. These islands.
So when China announced that it wanted air notification, they were simply putting themselves at the same position and claim that Japan had insisted upon for many years?
I would put it very differently, Congressman. In 1972, when Okinawa reverted from the U.S. to Japan, the administrative control of these islands, what the Japanese call the Senkakus, also reverted to Japan. Now, we don't take a position on the ultimate sovereignty, but the administrative control is there. With that administrative control came the air defense identification zone that the U.S. had created to create or to claim, as China did, an air defense identification zone over an area that is administered by another country, over an area that is so highly sensitive, is not, in my view, putting itself on a par with Japan.
They did just do what Japan was doing, albeit it's the U.S. position that Japan is the proper administrator of these islands at the present time. I don't think China necessarily accepts that, but I want to go on to another question. I'm an old CPA. We have something in my field called cost accounting, where you look at an enterprise, say, spending $600 or $700 billion, and allocate the expenditures to the various objectives and goals of the organization. It's not an easy thing to do. I would allocate, for example, 0 cents to defending Montana from Canadian invasion, though that is one of the responsibilities of our Pentagon. What portion of our overall military expenditures would you guess, or what range would you apply to what portion is confronting China in maritime areas?
Well, Congressman,
because I mean, if we weren't trying to achieve that goal, we could save a lot of money. Would that be a tenth, a quarter, what?
I'd be happy to consult with my colleagues in the Pentagon to try to get an answer for you, but I would take issue with the formula that we are devoting a portion of our defense budget to confront China.
Deal with in your response, you'll pick the right verb for whatever role we're playing in the oceans off of China. I just want to get a feel. Now, Japan spends only 1% of its GDP on its military. It now has a confrontation with China over these islands. Is there any effort in Japan to spend anything close to 4.4% of its GDP on defense now that it believes its territory is being infringed upon?
The Japanese defense budget is below 1% and has been in that general area since certainly I served for, speaking of Montana, Ambassador Mansfield in the 1980s. Under the government of Prime Minister Abe, and as a result of 5 years of sustained effort in the U.S.-Japan alliance, not only has the Japanese government increased, albeit marginally, its actual defense spending, but Japan has upped its strategic cooperation with the United States as an ally in ways that are hugely valuable to the U.S. The issue and the goal is not to contest territory with China. It's not to confront China. our common objective as an ally, as an alliance, is to bolster the security and the stability in the entire region.
If I can just reclaim. I mean, I've met with Pentagon people who do research, and they've said every research project is going to be focused on confronting China. We're not interested in doing the research that will help us develop weapons to do anything else. And that's what they tell me privately.
With all due respect, Congressman, a very significant part of the Japanese defense budget and defense cooperation is aimed at defense against North Korea. Right. A very significant amount of that is engaged in developing the capacity of Pacific Island and Southeast Asian partners.
The gentleman's time's expired. We are going to go in a second round after Mr. Perry here, so if you want to, we can take that up, or something else for that matter. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Russell, thank you for your testimony and being here today. Just a couple of things. It seems like, at least from my standpoint, we have an agreement on what should happen here, but maybe I might disagree with how we're going about it. I mean, I certainly understand toning down the rhetoric from our standpoint and trying to have a responsible conversation. The instruments of power that the United States is using, and the foremost in this regard is diplomatic, and I would agree with that. My concern is that while we are talking, it seems to me like China is doing. And while we're trying to bring down the tone and the rhetoric, they continue to do. And over a period of time, certain things that have occurred will become the commonplace, the new standard, and that's where we'll be. And maybe they'll push it, and maybe they won't, but they'll have moved the ball. So when we talk about the ADIZ or the incident with the cow pens, these are unilateral actions. And while we're talking, is there any measurable, is there anything tangible that the United States is doing to move the needle in the other direction?
Well, thank you, Congressman. To your point, I am convinced that ultimately our most effective instrument with China is diplomatic and political. There is a significant backlash. There is a measurable reaction in the Asia-Pacific region to the perception of Chinese assertiveness, to the incremental steps that you allude to make assertions and create facts on the ground or on the water. And that translates into an intensified demand signal for U.S. Military, diplomatic, economic engagement that many Chinese consider to be adverse to their interests.
So we're hoping that our actions will have the desired effect from within China. That's what I'm hearing.
We are using all the instruments of U.S. influence and particularly the diplomatic instruments to affect and shape China's choices in the direction of responsible behavior in support of a stable
I can appreciate
region.
that. I wonder if we know how far is too far. Have we established that? And I'm not asking you to tell me what it would be, but have we established how far is too far in regard to China's incursions?
Well, in this unclassified setting, Congressman, what I would say, without getting into tripwires or milestones, is that we have in no uncertain terms communicated through action as well as through high-level diplomacy to the Chinese our firm commitment both to honor our security commitments, alliances, to defend our interests, to remain engaged, and made clear in a number of ways that the behavior that the Chinese manifest with regard to their neighborhood has a direct impact on the prospects for
Okay, I mean, I get all that.
US-China
But so you tell me if I get a classified briefing, I'm going to find out that there's a point where the United States will say that's enough, enough is enough, and we're going to move to the next level. You're telling me in a classified setting, is there that point established right now?
The way that I would put it, Congressman, is that we are committed and determined to shape China's choices and influence China's behavior through all means of national and collective power.
I mean, listen, I get it. It sounds like diplomatic mumbo jumbo to me, and it's just, I almost fall asleep. I'm no disrespect intended, but I can't get to an answer here that suits me as to we have a definitive line. Is there a classified strategy that I can see? Do we have one? Yes or no? That you won't mention here, but is there a classified strategy that I might find elsewhere?
There is, Congressman, an abundance of classified strategy with respect to both China and to the South China Sea and the maritime disputes.
Let me ask you this. The treaty requirements and alliances we have were post-World War II or born out of World War II, at the end of World War II, with our allies in the region, and with maybe some of the other partners, China and otherwise. But that's essentially the genesis of what we're talking about regarding these incursions and unilateral actions, whether it's an ADIZ or what have you. That's what we're basing our foundation and our strategy on and our agreements. Am I right or wrong? I'm looking for clarification.
Our bilateral security commitments and alliances are one of the essential elements of our strategy, as I mentioned.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. We'll go into a second round now for anybody that might have any final questions. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Secretary, as you know, this year marks the 35th anniversary of the signing of the Taiwan Relations Act, which has withstood the test of time and has proved to be one of the, I think, most significant policy instruments in the Asia-Pacific region over time. Last week, Taiwan received news that the U.S. Air Force plans to defund the Combat Avionics Programmed Extension Suite, which is the CAPES program, which has huge implications for Taiwan. If continued, that program would upgrade 300 U.S. F-16s and 146 Taiwanese F-16s with top-line avionics. If unfunded, then Taiwan will likely either turn to South Korea or face the detrimental possibility of no upgrades and an aging fleet of ABs. The other option is for the U.S. to release new F-16CD fighters or F-35s, but despite consistent support from many of us here in Congress, this has not happened yet. Since the administration continues to deny Taiwan's request to buy F-16CD fighters, and is now cutting the CAPES program, what options does Taiwan have? What solution, a solution that's affordable to Taiwan, does the administration intend to offer? If the U.S. is going to follow through on its rebalance objectives, ensuring the security of our allies and friends, that's critical. This is an important issue, and I hope the administration takes finding a solution seriously. Could you comment on that?
Yes, well, thank you very much for raising the issue, Mr. Chairman. We take our unofficial relations with Taiwan, and we take our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act very seriously. The Obama administration in less than 5 years notified something on the order of $10 or $11 billion worth of arms sales to Taiwan, which is quite formidable. In addition, we have a sustained and a robust dialogue on security and defense issues. Our policy is that arms sales and our contribution to Taiwan's security contributes to cross-strait stability, and we are committed to helping to meet Taiwan's legitimate security needs. Now, this all occurs in the context of a one China policy consistent with the 3 U.S.-China communiques, as well as the Taiwan Relation Act that have been consistent over 8 U.S. administrations. What is different now, I would assert, Mr. Chairman, are 2 things. One is that the continued military buildup on the mainland side of the straits is unabated. And as in the past, that contributes to a sense of insecurity that in turn inspires the Taiwans to seek additional arms and security assistance. But the other thing that has changed since President Obama took office is the quality and the intensity of the cross-strait dialogue themselves. There has been a stabilizing dynamic in the relationship between Taiwan and the mainland, something that we very much support and encourage, and we hope to see continued progress towards reconciliation across the straits.
Thank you very much. I've got two more questions. I've only got a minute, so I'm going to boil them down pretty quickly, and if you could answer relatively briefly on both. One of the main things I think we've talked about here this afternoon is China kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of throwing its weight around with its being provocative and aggressive with a lot of its neighbors, and what should we do about that, and, with our allies. And let me just touch on the Philippines. For quite some time, the most powerful nation that the world has ever known had a pretty significant military base there, specifically at Subic Bay. And the Philippine government then decided that they no longer wanted that to be there. And of course, the Philippine people voiced their opinion relative to that. But, could you comment on what the relationship is between the Philippines' vulnerability to Chinese aggression and the absence of that base today? That's the first question. The other question is, when you go to Asia, everybody talks about TPP. That's at the top. You don't hear quite as much about it here in this country, unfortunately, but there it's really big, very important, and I think it's important. We ought to talk about it more here, too. But obviously, in order to pass TPP, TPA is going to have to come first. How much of an effort is the President going to make to accomplish that? Because he's going to need both Democratic support and Republican support if we're going to do TPA and TPP.
Well, thank you. I'll try to be brief, Mr. Chairman. On the topic of the Philippines, the U.S. is and remains fully committed to our Mutual Defense Treaty and to the security of the Philippines. We are not looking for bases in the Philippines or elsewhere, but what we are doing is working together to develop a framework agreement that will increase the U.S. access, will increase joint operations, and this will contribute very directly to the security of the Philippines.
Right, but that really wasn't my question was, what's the relationship between the lack of that base and their vulnerability? Do those two sort of two things kind of go hand in glove?
Again, I would tread carefully, not being military
undiplomatic.
Person, but I don't. Not representing the Pentagon, but the U.S. presence in the Asia-Pacific region is strong and formidable. We were able to deploy virtually instantly to the Philippines in response to Super Typhoon Haiyan using our existing bases in Okinawa and elsewhere. Even without Clark and Subic, we have, as the U.S., the capability. Okay. The Clark and Subic were not going to make the Philippines a military superpower, even if they had remained fully operational as joint bases to this day.
Okay.
If I might,
I'll answer my own question. I think their vulnerability is significantly related to the lack of that base there, and I think that was a strategic mistake on their part, and there wasn't much we could do about it because they said get out, we got out. But on the TPP and TPA.
The President on down, the administration is absolutely committed to seeing through TPP. Negotiators have been hard at work and I think are expected to meet shortly perhaps in the region at ministerial level. And the President, I know, has warmly welcomed the introduction of a bipartisan bill on TPA. Okay. Neither the U.S. nor any of the 11 members negotiating entered into this process with any intent other than to succeed in creating a high standard, comprehensive agreement that is going to create jobs and open markets. Okay. The President is determined to get there.
Excellent. Thank you. It's going to take a real effort, joint effort, both by the President, the administration, and the Congress as well to get this done. You didn't have any questions, did you? Did you have a question? Oh, okay. The ranking member, the gentlelady from Hawaii, is recognized.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions I hope to be able to get addressed briefly. Recognizing you're not speaking at all for the DoD, but also understanding that the overall strategy that the President is looking forward to in the Asia-Pacific region has a very strong integration of both military-to-military engagements as well as the diplomatic and economic engagements as well. Later this year, it'll be the first time that China was invited and has agreed to participate in the U.S.-led RIMPAC maritime exercise. I understand there have been arguments made by people who think that this kind of military-to-military engagement will benefit what the President's trying to accomplish in the Asia-Pacific region, and others say that providing this exposure to China could strengthen their warfighting capabilities. I'd like you to speak to that as to why this is the direction the President's decided to take.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The participation of the Chinese in RIMPAC is, in the view of the administration, very much in the best interests of the United States and U.S. security, as well as those of our regional partners. We have an interest and a stake in a professional Chinese military as compared to an unprofessional Chinese military. Moreover, China's ability to engage constructively and as an active participant in multilateral exercises directly relates to the goal of China contributing as a net security provider, a net security contributor to the region, whether it is in connection with anti-piracy, patrolling sea lanes, or securing international waters for the common good. The growth of and the intensity of mill-mill relations between the U.S. and China over the last 5 years, but particularly in the last year, is, in our view, a major contributor to long-term stability. The high-level engagement helps the Chinese People's Liberation Army understand what the U.S. is and isn't all about. That is fundamentally a good thing, in part because it is critical to debunk the mythology and the stereotypes widely held in the PLA that drive bad behavior.
I hope to be able to be in Hawaii for those exercises later this year. Last month, you were quoted in a newspaper calling for a mechanism for crisis prevention or crisis management in the event that incidents could trigger an escalatory cycle. I'm wondering if you talk about, what that trigger could be, as well, and what point the United States would really seek to implement this kind of crisis prevention or crisis management.
Well, the region has seen over the last few years, but certainly recently as well, a number of incidents, the tragic shooting of Taiwan fishermen by Philippines, the intersection of Chinese fishing vessel with the Philippine naval vessel, cable cutting incidents between Chinese Coast Guard and Vietnamese survey ships. The opportunities for some kind of incident, for some sort of miscalculation, are legion. In every case, it has been the ability to communicate that has been central to diffusing incidents. Now, governments in these cases have ultimately communicated capital to capital. We also believe that the ships themselves should be able to communicate bridge to bridge. And rather than making up on the spot solutions to problems, rather than delegating the decisions to junior officers in the heat of the moment to develop consistent rules, to reach agreement on mechanisms, whether they are hotlines or whether they are standard operating procedures, is going to play an important role in diffusing.
So you're kind of talking what in a combat setting we would talk about rules of engagement or something along those lines that would be standard within the area.
Right. Standardizing rules of engagement would be one element to a set of mechanisms that would help prevent or manage incidents should they occur.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, will wrap up for us here today.
Mr. Assistant Secretary, we've at the end we were kind of talking over each other. I was making the point that the Pentagon was devoting more and more of its resources, particularly at the research level and the force and designing its future force configuration, allocating, focusing on confronting China, particularly off the Chinese coast. You made the point, and I think it's a good one, that Japan faces quite a number of national security concerns. North Korea, its need to provide regional assistance to its partners in its neighborhood, and of course they've got territory that they have a dispute over, and they see the Chinese taking almost military action. And yet Japan is able to deal with all of those national security concerns, spending less than 1% of its GDP, and relies in significant part for its defense on getting the American taxpayer to pick up a big chunk of that. I didn't think this hearing was about trade. I'm delighted that it came up. The lion's share of our worldwide trade deficit is in the East Asia region, which is your bureau. I've talked to foreign ministers and ambassadors from other countries, and I say, what's your number one goal? It's promoting exports.
Yes.
Your bureau, again, the biggest trade, the lion's share of the largest trade deficit in the history of the world is the U.S. trade deficit in your region. What's the most successful and tangible and definitive success your bureau has had in promoting U.S. exports or reducing U.S. imports?
Well, the most recent and tangible success is the conclusion of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement.
I'll reclaim my time and point out that our trade deficit with South Korea has accelerated substantially as a result of and shortly after the effective date of that agreement. There's a tendency to say exports create jobs without ever mentioning that imports cost us jobs. Both are true. And in fact, our imports to from South Korea grew as a result of that agreement. Our exports eventually should go up, although in the first year they've declined. But clearly, the trade deficit with South Korea has grown and grown substantially after that agreement. We have a huge trade deficit with Japan. Japan is asking us to defend them as we have for over 60 years. Has Japan offered to make any concessions as to how much U.S. food they import or anything else in an effort to get us engaged in this island dispute they have, or do they feel that their claim on the U.S. taxpayer is sacrosanct and doesn't need to be encouraged through trade concessions?
Well, Congressman, as of course you know well, U.S. security assistance and commitment is not for sale. This is not something that we trade. The fact is that we're engaged in negotiations with Japan right now in the context of the TPP, in which the Japanese have made very significant concessions.
Only if we give them our auto market, but I'll point out, okay, the deal with South Korea increased our trade deficit. What assurance do we have that the negotiations you're referring to will not also increase our net trade deficit?
I was recently in Korea. I met with the American Chamber of Commerce and the representatives of a wide range of U.S. businesses, including U.S. auto manufacturers
who are looking to offshore our jobs and close down U.S. factories to increase profits. How did you help them do that? Sorry for the facetious question. Go on.
U.S. businesses are reporting unprecedented access to the Korean market, in significantly enhanced opportunities for exports. And we believe that the successful conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership by lowering barriers and by bringing high standards to countries like Japan,
Mr.
like
Secretary,
Malaysia.
I'll reclaim my time and say the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing and expect another result. Our agreement, numbers don't lie. I'm an old CPA. I look at the numbers, and our trade deficit with South Korea has grown very substantially after that agreement. And if we do it again on a bigger scale, we should expect the same results, only bigger. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired, so we'll finish up the hearing with the definition of insanity here this afternoon. And we greatly appreciate your testimony here this afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Members will have 5 legislative days to submit questions or revise their statements. And if there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Okay, good. But I mean, it is on, right? We're leaving Saturday and everything. Good deal. Thank you. Good to see you all.
Michael?
Thank you. Take care. Good seeing you. Kevin?
Okay. Pick up all this stuff. Oh, sorry, Steve.
It looked, the way I had it open, it looked like part of the equipment.